Stories of an Aircraft Builder.
Now, the first triplane replica of young Achim Engels was finished, and one might think that this urge to build airplanes was satisfied for the time being. But far from it. The next airplane was not long in coming, but the time in between passed without a newspaper article, and so I'll just tell you the story myself. During the time when the first triplane was being built, I was a student. I met my friend Wolfgang, who had helped a lot with it at grammar school. I didn't conform to the rules at grammar school, and so, under certain circumstances, I ended up at secondary school. Wolfgang left grammar school a year later and went to secondary school too. I then did my vocational baccalaureate by the second educational route and worked part-time in my father's chain of electronic stores, some of which I then took over full-time. The friendship with Wolfgang petered out over the next few years, and I continued on my flying path alone. At some point, I couldn't put it off any longer, and I was called up for military service, which I did in the 4th Paratrooper Battalion 252 in Nagold in the Iceberg Barracks. That was in 1993, less than 2 years after the first triplane was completed. But time did not pass unused. Following the construction of the triplane, I continued to work on the drawings and made corrections to recognized errors. In addition, all this knowledge was compiled in a compact form in an 830-page book entitled Fokker Dr.I, 3 Wings, 1 Legend, which was eventually only be available in German. The basic idea for this book was to make it as comprehensive as possible about the triplane. This included Fokker's history and career as a person, as well as the history of his works. I also wrote a complete technical description of the triplane for this book and drew 3-page views of all 60 of the airplanes he produced between 1912 and 1918 in 1/72 scale. I wrote many of the last pages of the book during my service at the Iceberg Barracks as a non-commissioned officer on duty. I was just 21 years old at the time. My time as a non-commissioned officer on duty also allowed me to clear the desks in the office of my former sergeant major at night and draw there. This resulted in complete drawings for Otto Lilienthal's gliders, which I also worked on almost as a sideline, because at the weekends I wanted to take on the construction of such an apparatus. When my book about the triplane was finished, I was looking for a publisher who wanted to publish it. That's when I realized how the publishing industry works in our society and how it was holding us all back. In principle, all the publishing houses I wrote to were interested, but they said that the size was too big from a sales point of view. They came back with suggestions of changes of up to 80%, mainly deletions. That was not at all possible. The English publishing house Hikoki Publication, which would have been satisfied with a deletion of 40% of the content, was the best still. But that would have missed out the point. I've always preferred a few readers who are really interested in a topic rather than a whole bunch of customers who I fob off with very little just to get their money and be able to produce and then sell large volumes. As my father, Karl-Heinz Engels, was currently working on the compilation of his book on his own theory of the origin of the world entitled From Star Plasm to the Planetary System, we decided to set up our own publishing house and to produce the whole thing ourselves. The little money we had went mainly into his book, which was produced as a paperback in the first edition. There was little left for me, but paperback wasn't feasible for my size anyway. Since I was interested in the bookbinding trade as such anyways, I decided to familiarize myself with the craft, built a stitching drawer, built all the other necessary tools for this, and produced my book myself in a limited edition of 50 copies. My tour of duty was not yet over when some of my nights as a non-commissioned officer on duty and/or guard were spent designing a leaflet in which I put together an advanced order form for my book, which I distributed wherever I could. I still have one of these leaflets in my archive, which I am happy to show you here. It was quite exciting, but I was actually able to sell all the books in my limited edition in advance to this. The price at the time was 120 German marks, and the cover was made of green leatherette with gold embossed titles, which I also made myself. At the same time, I also produced an illustrated book about the reconstruction of the triplane, which I immediately produced in our new publishing house. It was entitled Reconstruction, Fokker Dr.I, and was the forerunner of the In Detail series that you may know today. Unfortunately, I only have one cover of this first illustrated book. If any of you have an original copy, I would be very happy if you would send it to our archive. The name of Fokker Team Schorndorf was also created in those days. That was actually more a joke. I was leafing through an illustrated book about the restoration of the Halberstadt CL4 by the Technic Museum in Berlin, and there was a photo in it showing the workers on the project in overalls with the words Halberstadt Team Berlin on the back. Well, I can do that too, I thought, and from then on I called myself the Fokker Team Schorndorf. No one would believe that one person could pull it all together and keep it rolling anyways. My thick book on the triplane was quickly stitched and sent out in all its copies. Back then I wrote the texts on a 286 computer, then also a 386, using a program called StarWriter. Maybe someone still knows it. I then divided the entire text block into individual sections and added to them. This resulted in my series German Aircraft Technology 1900 through 1920, which I eventually produced as small DNA 5 booklets first and then as A4 size books later on. For a long time I produced and sold these books as paperback booklets. At some point it was all too stupid for me. All the logistics behind it were too much effort. Paper procurement, printing, cutting, binding, trimming, storing, packing, sanding, and I always wanted to sell the books as cheaply as possible. I still remember my own childhood very well, when everything written was so far away and unattainable because it was expensive and there was no money. How I would loved to have bought Ray Rimmel's illustrated books from the Windsock Data Files series back then. At some point I started using the internet and looked for a server space at Strato. I learned how to write the HTML texts for the site design. At that time everything was still optimized for 17-inch monitors. That's why my website is still so confusing today, because little by little everything was more or less badly adapted by myself to more modern conditions. But you can see that for yourself when you visit my website www.fokker-team-schorndorf.de. Another reason for creating my website under the label of Collector's Edition was a dispute I had with Jerry Coase from Fine Art Models. But I'll tell you about this funny part in the next episode of Stories of an Aircraft Builder.